This is my environment that I'm working in. These switches here. So Leaf 1 and 2 are Catalyst switches. Leaf 3 is an Arista virtual switch. And then I have a spine that's also a Cisco Catalyst device. So these are all up and running, but at the moment there's no current configuration. So I should be able to log into this still. Should be running. Let me get this out of the way. I'm just moving the Google Meets pop-up out of my way. All right, so what I want to do is go into Leaf 1. Okay. And make sure that we're good. And then, yeah, so I think there's only, the problem with these Catalyst switches is there's only like 8 ports for this virtual switch model. But you can see there's nothing configured here yet. There's just this one here that goes to the spine. That's in no switch port because it's a layer 3 port. So that's how the Cisco, both the Ciscos are in this state. And then the Arista should have 20 ports. So that's why I'm kind of starting with the Arista, because it has more ports, just to give us a better feel for it. Yeah, so these are 20 empty ports. All right, so let's look at the first playbook that I want to show you. And let me kind of close some of these out. They should all be saved, and I'll make this repo available publicly too afterwards. So in this network demos, I have a folder called Leaf Switches here. All right, so just to give you a quick walkthrough, in the Leaf Switches, I have some group variables. So at the group level, I have an Arista group and a Cisco group. And there's some, very clear differences between those devices at the group level. So I've established things like when I connect to the Cisco switch, we're using ILS, right? And then in the Arista, we'll have the EOS for the connection. Type is CLI, but the network OS is very different. So that's a difference. And then I did the VLANs, and the VLAN configuration is a little bit different too. So I did it at the group level. So when you configure private VLANs in Cisco, it's a bit different than Arista. So I needed to do that at what we will call the host level. So I have host vars for some of those things. So group vars are good for things that you can apply to an entire group, even though I only have the one, or I have the 2 Cisco switches, but only have the 1 Arista. But effectively, we had more than 1 Arista. It would apply to everything that was in that group. So we start off with that hierarchy. So this configuration will build my VLANs on both of the Cisco devices. And then when I drill into the Cisco devices, I have host vars. So the host vars is where a lot of the configuration, when I mention resource modules, is going to come from these host vars, because Ansible will look into host vars by default, and it'll run those specific configurations, these YAML files, when I call a playbook with an inventory that has the Cisco switches, right? So for each host, it has its own very unique configuration. And then also for the Arista's layer, the Leaf 3. So just real quick, if I go into interfaces on Leaf 1, this was the interface module that focuses more at the physical layer and like descriptions. So the other thing was templates. I'm pointing to some templates, so we'll see how that works. And then layer 2 gets into, what we're running, what VLANs, and if they're access or trunks. So that's the layer 2. And then layer 3, there's not a whole lot going on because I don't have too many interfaces, but there's a few, layer 3 interfaces on the Ciscos. And this is the Arista. So very similar, I just have more ports. And, the actual data structure looks a little tiny bit different, but it's pretty close between Cisco and the Arista. So the one that we'll be looking at as well is the templates. So I have a config for when I run the templates, the Jinja 2 templates. What interfaces do I want to run them on? So that's what these are for the Arista. And then the Cisco will look a little bit different because that's where we're calling the template from that that interfaces module. Here's actual Jinja 2 templates that you'll see in the playbook. So I got like a lot of different things going on, but like, let me dial it back a bit. What I want to show you is the first one, which is like not the best approach, but this is like a common approach that people use, and I used it a lot too earlier on, is using those config modules. So let me close out these variables, and then I have this vars directory with this arista.yaml. This is the configuration that I am declaring for the Arista switch that I'm going to run a playbook against using this configuration. And you can see that everything that I have here is going to map to the lines parameter. So these are all lines of configuration. And the way that I'm organizing it is I'm creating a dictionary name here based off of what VLAN it is, which is pretty common, right? So like I'm dividing my config up based off of what VLANs are being assigned. And then sometimes there's different types of devices or something like that. So the config may vary that I'm going to apply to a particular VLAN. And then obviously if it's a trunk, like it is at the bottom here, that's going to be a different configuration. But these are, this is the same command lines that I would run, from the interface from the CLI. I'm just applying them using a playbook. So this is pretty straightforward. Again, like you have to have, your knowledge has to be closer to the CLI to be able to do the proper syntax, right? Because these all have to be valid configurations. And you also need to have parents, right? So if you look at VLANs, it's a dictionary called VLANs, but the ID would be the parent config, because that's the first part of configuring the VLAN is the ID. So whatever the VLAN number that you're assigning to it. And then optionally, you can set the name, or it assigns like the default name, but you can set the name. So that would be a line under a parent that you'll see in, let's take a look at the actual playbook. So this Arista switch slow is the playbook for the first one. And you can see here, I'm not using host vars. I'm pointing to that one configuration file right here. And then that's where I've defined that configuration for all of these different things, all these different access VLANs. The first part was the VLANs themselves. You can see parents is the ID. So item.id, and we're going to loop and iterate through that. And this is probably where a lot of the performance issues come from, is when I'm using line parameters, and because I'm going through different ports that don't have the exact same configurations, and I can't always do like port ranges because I might have like VLAN 50 on ports that aren't, ranged together, then I'll use a loop because it makes sense to be able to iterate through configurations. But loops and things like that add a little bit of a penalty, right? And then it's just an order of magnitude worse depending on how many ports or how many VLANs are we, task are we going to run through all these different ports, as an example. So that we can see and start to like realize and quantify like how long it actually is taking from the output, because we'll see like how long it takes. But even on the screen, you can see like it goes one by one as it iterates and reads in these configs. But again, this is like a common way. A lot of configs in Ansible are done this way. And then people over time tend to start to adopt the resource modules, and also the validated content that we have, like that's more recent, that like you can wrap around use cases. That tends to use the resource modules as well, because there's some validated content around interfaces. But again, that's a Cisco thing, but it does do a lot of the abstraction so that you don't even have to get into like this level. You're just, creating like an inventory and calling the role, and it's building a lot of the config. But you have the same issue where it can only do what the resource modules can do, and then you have to round it out, to complete that configuration for anything that you need that doesn't exist in the resource modules. So having said all that, let's go ahead and jump into the Ansible automation controller. And then the first one, they all start with leaf, so I can search that way. We want the slow one. And you're going to look at it, it's not really that much slower than these guys because it's such a small config. but you'll get a general idea because you'll see how the output comes out. So let's go ahead and start this one off. The first part, it's just, it's got to go through and sync up with the source control, and now it's actually running the playbook. But see how like it's rendering it line by line. To speed it up, I did do some port ranges, but again, you're not always that lucky where you can use ranges too effectively. Like right here, you can see Ethernet 5 through 8. So that helps a little bit. But we have 20 ports here. Just imagine if we had, like 400 ports. So that's where it starts to make a much bigger difference, and it's more appreciable. Some of the other things we'll try here shortly. Right, so we configured the trunk. So now when we go back, let me go back to here so we can go into the device and do a show run. All right, so now you can see the ports have different configurations. They're not all in a row, right? So that was just kind of the point I was trying to make. But some of them I was able to do some ranges like those 2 or 3. And they've all got a configuration. And the last one should be a trunk. So that's pretty straightforward, and it works. But again, we have to know what we want to configure. And we have to, account for just that lag that it's going to take, because we have to use loops and stuff. If you look at a lot of the best practices for developing content around Ansible, they usually frown against using too many loops in the playbook. And a lot of that is because it'll start to add more of that performance penalty. So the second one is, okay, we built this way. What I want to do is change this switch completely. So the config is going to be completely different. I'm going to use different VLANs and different configs and different templates that I'd like to apply, because I have some IP phones and cameras and stuff. This was pretty straightforward. It's just very simple configs, but still kind of in my opinion, kind of dragged out a little bit. So we can do a much more complicated configuration quicker by using the resource modules in the templates. So when I go back to here, I'm going to bring up a different job template. And if you're not familiar with job templates, that's just how we manage the playbook in the automation controller. Think of it as the command line with all the options and flags that you can set, but you can set them from here to manage how you want to run a playbook. When you're running multiple playbooks together, you can create a workflow, and then you can stitch them together with more logic and other integrations into tools. But this one, I'm just doing the one-to-one mapping with a job template to the playbook. So we're going to do this Arista config here next. But before we do that, let's just take a little bit look at the playbook. So we saw what this one did, or this playbook. The slow. Oh, I got to move this down to see it. Right, this was the slow. Not a very complicated playbook. It just takes a while to iterate through all that stuff. So the next one is this one. So this one, I'm going to use the Arista EOS _ VLANs module, which is a resource module to create some VLANs, some new VLANs. And then I'm using the interfaces and layer 2 interfaces and layer 3 interfaces to configure most of what I need. And then I do have some things to round out in terms of gaps that aren't in the layer 2 or interfaces resource module. So I'm going to use the templates to handle that part. So this is how we call the template, right? So the template is in the templates directory right here. This is a Jinja 2 template. And I have different, like this is one file, but when I iterate through this, what I'm doing is I'm pointing to a variable that I set, or a variable file that I set at the host vars level for the Arista. So if I open this up, you can see that I have the ones that we've been using, interfaces, layer 2, layer 3 for the resource modules. And then I created one called templates. So this one here has the configuration for the variables that are in that templates Jinja 2 file. And all I really am doing in those templates is I have different templates for different types of use cases, like port security, IP cameras, IP phones, just like Cisco Catalyst has on box. I'm effectively emulating that, or modeling that, and creating this locally in my own Jinja 2 templates. And I'm just expressing what interfaces do I want to run these templates against. So for port security, it's Ethernet 4, cameras is on 2, and then I have like a range of these 2 ports for the private VLANs, because one is the, I should just say private VLAN. One is the promiscuous port, another one's a community port. And then I've got, oh yeah, there is 2. I'm sorry, I didn't see that one. Yeah, so these 2 are those. And then the rest of them are just access and trunk ports that I didn't need templates for. So those are configured here. So this configuration will be sent, and the descriptions kind of align with what it's doing. So these are the ones that need templates. These, VLAN 10 access ports don't need a template because this config is completely covered, in the scope of those resource modules. So just the ones that that you see these descriptions, and also that are a part of this, Jinja 2 file that I have in templates. Right. So here's the actual configs that it will add. So port security doesn't have a resource module, so that's why that's in here. And some of the quality of service commands, and some of the private VLAN stuff. Some of it's there, some of it's not, or at least like in Arista, I couldn't figure it out. So I just rounded out what I needed to configure it, using these templates. So it'll iterate through these, and you'll notice that this one here, port security, has 4 port in ports, right? So what this is doing is this will iterate a loop from a Jinja 2 template, and it's looking for a dictionary that's called ports. So that's why I had to add a new configuration file, and this is ports. So ports has the name is Ethernet 4 for that interface, and that was what we see here is we want the port.name. So that'll be the Ethernet 4. And then on Ethernet 4, it's going to apply these configurations along with the configurations that were already configured from the resource modules. So that'll make more sense when we see the output. You'll kind of see that happen in order. But I wanted to give you like the lower level of what's going on under the hood here. So this is the Jinja 2. And all these examples, again, I'll make these available publicly. I'll put a repo out there with a link in the meetup site. If you go to the past events, I usually put like any slide decks or repos and those types of things. You can go back at your leisure and have access to them. And I'll put the recording on YouTube as well for the demo. So let's go ahead and go here and launch this. By doing the source control. Right now it's going. Oh, wait a minute, that's the old job. This one. Like you can click into these, and this is what was sent. This is like the command line representation, because those resource modules always show you what the command line is. And then it has the structured data. So that was the before config. This was the config that that we did from the previous playbook. And then the after, we changed a bunch of VLANs, and we have different templates that we use to make some of these configurations. right? And then this is the last part, was actually applying the templates here. So here's the different templates, and see how they're going to different interfaces. So that happened fairly quick, right? And it's a much more complicated configuration. So when we go back now and look at our switch, we can see the config is completely different. We replaced it. And so here's the new configuration. But anything that where you see like port security and some of these other configs that are not covered in the resource module, we did that through the templates. But the access and trunk configs and things like that, they were actually from the module. So again, like if we look at the module, which module is this? This is the config module. I want to go back to like the interface module. So for comparison, if I look at my interface module, this is what you can configure, right? So, and most of this is just again, it's the physical characteristics and things like that. The description, right? So not a whole lot going on there. There's a lot more, or the part that's a little bit more important with this one is the layer 2 module. So if I look at the layer 2 module, I can glean, the parameters that are there. So we have all this, access VLAN and trunk config, but you don't see port security and, a lot of those types of configs. So even like if you look at Cisco between Arista does have a little less coverage now that I look at this a little bit closer. So that's how you would, use this for the bulk of it, because a lot of your ports, or all of your ports, are either going to need to be access trunks or layer 3 ports. So you can quickly do that from resource modules, and then if you want to overlay those other configs, and alternatively, you could do switch port mode access and those types of things as part of your template, Gen 2 template as well, instead of doing this. But then you lose some of the other capabilities with the built-in diffs. You can do diffs. It's a little bit different process, but you can effectively compare line by line. So I use the resource modules, since there's other resource modules too, right, for SNMP and OSPF and BGP and so on and so forth. So it becomes kind of like a standard, but then there are the gaps to consider. So again, that's where we fall back to the templates. So the third one, which is a little bit different, is the Cisco one. So if we look at Cisco, let me go back into here, and let's look at this Cisco switch port. And this one is kind of unprecedented outside of the catalyst, right? So when I learned about this feature, I thought it was pretty cool that you could do a custom one. I started thinking, yeah, that makes a pretty good workaround. So with this one here, I'm using the VLAN module like we've been doing, or in the previous one like we did, create some VLANs. I think it's the same VLAN, so that should just be OKs. We're not really changing them. But then from a port security template, instead of creating a Gen 2 template, I'm using a config module to configure that template on the switch. And then once it's there, that custom, user-defined template, then it's available for all of my ports. So I just need to do this once. So it's like a one-off command that happens, fairly quickly. And then I had this community template for a config that I needed for my private VLANs. And then the rest of this is just reading in the resource modules. So this is very much the same as we did with the Arista. So the same idea here, we have the, those configs as host vars for each one of the Cisco switches, but we are going to leverage those templates. So when I create a template, if it's not one of the default configs that's already there, it'll show up in my running config. If it's one of the built-in configs, like the camera that I mentioned earlier and the IP phone, it applies those configs when you connect a device to those ports. So that's how it works. It's meant to create these macros that as the port becomes live, it applies those best practice configurations. But for your user ones, you'll see those actually in your running config when it's a config that you're actually changing in the running config. Because if you put The reason I mention that is I put some default ones in there, like the default config for a port already, and then you don't see those because it didn't change. It's already there, right? So it's just the ones that you're actually adding. So having said that, we've got this here. We've got these variables here for leaf1 is one of the Cisco's. And there is no other config because it's the templates that are on the box. So before I run this, just to show you that, let's take a look at those templates in case you haven't seen this before. Show template. If you do all, you'll see everything that's in here. So right now at the moment, there's one for an access point. See how there's a lot of quality of service related configs too. Work our way down. Here's the one I did, the camera and the IP phone. All right, so these are all built in, which means they're just there. You're connecting to a router interface. So those are there. So I'm adding the two in my playbook. So you'll see they'll show up, after we run the playbook. So I'll go ahead and run the playbook and we'll configure the ports. The ports themselves at the moment should be empty. Right, so both switches are just the default from spinning it up in the container lab. And let's go ahead and take a look at this. So now I want to go back to templates, leaf. And this one is the Cisco. Kick that off. Okay. It's doing the source control. That's why it takes, when it's pulling down from the repo, I just check to make sure that, what happened here? I must have mucked around. Oh, let me jump into the job template real quick. All right, so details, and then I'll go into job template. I changed the name of this playbook. That's why I can't find it. So I just need to go in here into the edit and find it. My apologies. Here we go. Leaf Cisco. Originally, I just called it switch ports. And then when I decided to use Arista and Cisco, then I changed the names, but I forgot to change it in here. So we'll save the job template. And we'll thank the demo gods that I was able to figure that out. So it's running. These are the templates that we're adding. And then from that, we're configuring our interfaces. All right. So that's about like half as much time as like the original one. I don't know about the last one. It's probably closer together for that. But all right, so it completed the config. And if you recall earlier, like when we're doing resource modules, the built-in shows us like the commands, the before structured data, and then the after from it making the changes. So that's just a part of every resource module is like that. So what we should see now is we have those templates. So let's verify that real quick. And obviously they're there because it worked, the config worked, or at least we think the config worked. So show template. Well, actually, I'm sorry, I didn't do the right command. It's yeah, show template in all. Scroll up, I think. Yeah, here's my stuff. So here's the port security one that I added. And then here's a private VLAN config that I needed to add. So that is in there. And then these are all the ones, the built-in ones that we looked at before. So let me X out there. And then when we do show run, we can see the port configs. All right, so these are commands that this is from the template. And see how it also shows you the ones that we called a template. But some of these don't really have anything, like the camera one doesn't really, you won't see this until you plug something in, it'll apply. Those built-in ones are a little bit different. But we don't need to, like it'll, as long as you have that template, that built-in template called, it'll use those configs like when you plug into that port. And then for ours, the private VLAN and what was the other one? The port security one were from us. And there's the trunk. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So just to recap real quick, you can use the lines parameter from the config modules from all these different vendors. You can use the source parameter if you want to call a Jinja 2 template. I was using the Jinja 2 template for bits and pieces of configs to round out things that I couldn't do directly from the resource modules. And then in a resource module, in the interface resource module, in the Catalyst IOSXC collection in particular, I can call one of these on-box templates, these iOS templates on a Cisco Catalyst switch. So, but that was specific to Catalyst, not Nexus. Unless there's some other way to do it on the Nexus, I'll have to look a little bit more into that, but I couldn't find it, at least offhand when I was looking the other day. So with that being said, and I know we're almost out of time here,